The Mother Redcap in Archway, or Upper Holloway, here on the Holloway Road, recently reopened after a period of closure of about 2 years. It's always really good news when a pub reopens after being shut for a while like that. Cheers from the Mother Redcap. I know that says Guinness there, but I'm actually having a pint of Murphy's. I don't know if this is a special offer for the time of day, but this was very reasonably priced. £5 for a pint. These are all keg taps. That's pretty typical in Irish pubs, isn't it? They have Guinness and Murphy's and a few other things. But if you are into your keg stouts, then I think that's a pretty good example thereof. I found this pub intriguing because although you might initially think the Mother Redcap is a unique name, it in fact shared it for much of its history with another pub here in North London that we know today as the World's End in Camden. I have covered that before in a video on Camden town pubs, and I think that changed its name to the World's End in something like 1985. But for most of its history, North London, really only a couple of miles apart, we had two pubs called the Mother Redcap. At least one legend surrounding the other Mother Redcap pub, the one down in Camden, suggests that the name had derived from a herbalist or possibly a witch who had lived in a cottage on that site prior to the pub being established. That might give the impression that that was the original Mother Redcap and the one here in Holloway is an imitator, and that's somewhat backed up by John Rock's map of 1746, a couple of decades before Camden town was even built. At that point the pub is marked on the map as Old Mother Redcaps, and it's surrounded by nothing but fields. But the Mother Redcap here in Holloway already existed at that time, and in fact had been here for at least a century by then. Upper and Lower Holloway are also shown on that map, two settlements along that ancient droving route, and although the Mother Redcap there isn't explicitly labelled, we know it did exist at that time, and I suspect it probably corresponds to this building and the surrounding gardens. We will delve more into the history of the Mother Redcap here in Holloway, but first let's take a look at the pub building as we find it today. It's a corner pub, 3 stories in stock brick, here on the corner of Holloway Road and a small side street called Whitley Street. It's often cited as being rebuilt in 1871. I think it's actually a couple of years later, 1873, based on the minutes of proceedings of the Metropolitan Board of Works. And that snippet also gives us the name of the architect, George Treacher. We've encountered him a couple of times before in these videos. This pub and 2 of his others, the Burlington Arms near Savile Row and the Yorkshire Grey in Fitzrovia, are quite similar. In particular, this slight recess in the brickwork on the curved corner. That seems to be a trademark of his. An old sign frame hanging from the first floor shows this was a one-time Taylor Walker pub. You can tell by the cannon, and there's also a box lantern suspended over the corner entrance, which I assume is also a relic of that era. I think the ground floor pub frontage possibly came a bit later than that 1870s rebuild, maybe in the 1890s, as this looks to me to be our old friend Norwegian Larvikite, and that wasn't commercially available until at least the 1880s. There were a total of 4 entrances originally, a couple of which are now blocked, and as usual that's a hint to how at one time the internal space of the pub would have been subdivided into a public bar, a saloon bar, possibly something like an off-sales area, and so on. Moving inside, it has, of course, all been opened up today. The internal partitions separating the public bar from the other parts are long gone, but you can get a bit of a sense for how that layout might once have been from these baffles, if that's the right word for them, on the bar counter. They're topped with these carved flourishes, almost like a fleur-de-lis, and curiously are also numbered, although I assume those numbers are a modern addition. I think that's probably just something akin to a table number. The bar counter is a bit of an eclectic mix with those baffles, again if that's the right word for them, then something like a strip of marble below the countertop and matchboard panelling below that, interspersed with turned wooden supports, now painted red. I wonder if some part of the bar back might have survived here. Elements of that could conceivably be Victorian. Probably the main highlight for me is the tiled wall to the left-hand side as you come in, and given that, I imagine the saloon bar would have been over this side originally. At least in style, these tiles could be Victorian. Slender panels between the mirrors, each with a very tall plant growing out of a pot, and then a different design and style lower down, a bit more mosaic-like. The mirrors in between are obviously more modern. Those tiles continue all the way through to a little snug at the back, which I thought is probably the nicest space of the pub. It was also one of the quieter parts. The pub as a whole did have piped music playing on my visit, but I don't think there's any speakers in this small room, which is good. That room is lit by a skylight overhead and has tiling on 3 sides as well as a small fireplace. On the other side of the pub, which I suspect may originally have been the public bar, there isn't any tiling. Some parts have bare brickwork, and there are more modern additions in keeping with the Irish pub theme. More nooks, crannies, and another snug to be found here, which I think is a really nice touch. Finally, the ceiling, in a reassuringly pubby red tone, looks like it could be Lincrusta to me, that embossed covering, below which are some shallow beams in a grid pattern. Overall, a really nice effect, very pubby, and I could believe that at least some of this internal fabric is Victorian. The big TV screens aren't really my cup of tea, but obviously that will be a big draw to a lot of other customers, and live sports do often seem to go hand in hand with Irish pubs, at least here in England. Returning to the pub's history then. The earliest reference I'm aware of is in a poem in 1638 titled Drunken Barnaby's 4 Journeys to the North of England. It's a bawdy affair, so I won't read too much of it, and it does seem to suggest the Mother Redcap was a bit of a den of ill repute at that time, but you can clearly see there the Mother Redcap in Holloway. Perhaps we can pause there for a minute and take that in. 1638. We're talking about nearly 400 years ago. There are vanishingly few pubs in London that can claim that kind of documented continuity. Yes, admittedly, at that point in history, Holloway wouldn't have been considered part of London. It was a village in the countryside surrounding the city. But still, many pubs in those rural areas, now swallowed up by Greater London, were lost along the way. And I think this survival is really quite impressive. Albeit, of course, the pub has been rebuilt a couple of times during its history, as most have. What's also interesting about that mention in the 1630s is that it predates by several decades the admittedly possibly apocryphal letter which details the legend of the Mother Redcap in Camden. The claim date on that was 1666, yes, the year of the Great Fire of London, and I went through that in the Camden pubs video, but the whole thing does seem a bit far-fetched. Anyway, once again, a suggestion that, potentially, this Mother Redcap is in fact older than the one in Camden. So, if it wasn't named after a witch who lived in what we now know as Camden Town, where does this name Mother Redcap come from? There does seem to be a fair amount of disagreement over this. A book in 1842 titled Merry England in the Olden Time, I'll admit that doesn't sound like the most rigorous of historical sources, mentions in a footnote that there were 2 ancient hostelries of that name at that time, but the author is inclined towards thinking that the Holloway one came first. Moreover, this book says that Mother Redcap is doubtless an emanation from Eleanor Rumming, and that it was a favourite sign during the 16th and 17th centuries. Eleanor Rumming is the subject of another poem, this one dating to around 1550, by John Skelton. She was a pub landlady in Leatherhead, down in Surrey, famed for serving short measures and overcharging her customers. Skelton isn't particularly kind about his muse here, spending many lines of the poem being really quite rude about her physical appearance, but he does also mention her clothes, and apparently she had a Lincoln green hood. So based on that, how she is connected with Mother Redcap is unclear, although it does say further down she had a Bristol red kirtle. That's a dress of the era. There's actually an entry in the Oxford English Dictionary for Mother Redcap. The term there is described as the name of a disreputable woman, especially a female innkeeper, and they give as the earliest citation the registers of the Company of Stationers in 1594. The register in turn refers to a book titled Mother Redcap, Her Last Will and Testament, containing sundry conceited, not quite sure if that's the right word, and pleasant tales furnished with much variety to more delight. That book has been lost, but I wonder if that notion of Mother Redcap as a storyteller may have continued through to a long rambling poem in 1627 called The Moon Calf, wherein 4 old ladies, one of them Mother Redcap, take it in turns to tell stories. And I think there's possibly a suggestion that they were all former alewives. Certainly their stories are told over ale, sat around a fire. So that gives a very benign figure called Mother Redcap, one of the village storytellers, but the second reference the OED gives in 1597 does seem to be back to the idea of Mother Redcap as a witch, as associated with the pub in Camden. It's a bit gruesome actually. Yonder comes Mother Redcap, look how they beat her brains out. See what it is to be a witch, see how the toads gnaw the flesh from her bones. Oh dear. Given all of that, I'm not sure there is one definitive legend, and almost certainly not an individual real person behind Mother Redcap. It seems to just be a recurring name that's used in various different contexts for essentially any old lady who happens to wear a red hat. But she is often associated with ale and pubs, and it was clear that, at least by the 17th century, it had become a fairly common pub name. As in 1630 we have a book titled Wine, Beer, Ale and Tobacco Contending for Superiority, and in a passage talking about ale, it says, "You shall be allowed a Robin Hood or Mother Redcap to hang on your door to beckoning customers." Many pubs lay claim to at one time having the great diarist Samuel Pepys as a customer, but at this pub, for once, it actually seems quite credible. He probably came to the Mother Redcap in Holloway in 1661, and although he doesn't name it explicitly, he wrote this in his diary on the 24th of September that year. So we rode easily through and only drinking at Holloway at the sign of a woman with cakes in one hand and a pot of ale in the other, which did give good occasion of mirth, resembling her to the maid that served us. It would be at least a bit of conjecture to assert that he's talking about the Mother Redcap in Holloway there, were it not for the fact that we have a depiction of the pub sign from around that time in the form of a trade token. These were issued by various pubs as a substitute for low-value coinage at a time when small change was in short supply. There's an old sketch of the token in that 1842 book I mentioned earlier. The token is dated 1667, at which time the landlord is John Baxter, and it does appear in the sign of the pub that there's a lady with a pot of ale in one hand and maybe a cake in the other. I believe the cake depicted on the sign would have been one of the cheesecakes for which Holloway was famous at that time, sold both here and at the Half Moon pub. Accounts of the pub in the 18th century seem to be mostly concerned with highway robbery nearby. In 1738 there's an account of two footpads robbing Mr. Gravener, an eminent surgeon and apothecary near the Mother Redcap in Holloway. The thieves startled the medical man's horse such that he was thrown off. Then they proceeded to rifle through his pockets, taking 7 guineas and a silver watch. But when they found the tools of his trade, a case of silver instruments, they returned them in a very civil manner. They apologised for frightening his horse, said they hoped he hadn't been hurt by the fall, and wished him a good night. Furthermore, in 1775, the landlord of the Mother Redcap himself, Mr. Brown, was robbed by 2 highwaymen close to the pub. Then in 1786 we have a shoe polisher who made a bet that he could hop from the Mother Redcap to the top of Highgate Hill with his foot in his right hand in under 15 minutes. He managed the feat, watched by a large crowd, with a minute and a half to spare. The 1867 book, The History of Signboards, mentions the Mother Redcap, giving that reference to Drunken Barnaby, and also citing a verse which at one time accompanied the sign. Old Mother Redcap, according to her tale, lived 20 and 100 years by drinking this good ale. It was her meat, it was her drink, and medicine besides, and if she still had drunk this ale, she never would have died. The earliest Ordnance Survey map, which covers the Mother Redcap in Upper Holloway that I could find online, was surveyed in 1869, just prior to when the pub was last rebuilt. The footprint of the building is larger at the time of that OS map, and it's set back from the road a bit, but it is on the corner of Whitley Road, as it is today, and it was obviously considered a significant landmark, as it's named in full at a time when the norm for pubs was just to be marked with a PH, like this other one a bit further down the road. That footprint and position relative to the road looks consistent with a sketch held at the London Metropolitan Archives by Charles Henry Matthews, likely sometime around the 1850s. Alas, I can't show you the original for copyright reasons, but once again I got out my colouring pencils and made my own childish attempt at a sketch based on it. I think the projecting sign at the top of the main building there is possibly advertising for Coombe, Delafield and Co.'s beer, although the text is a bit hard to read, even in the original. That brewery was acquired by Watney's in the late Victorian era. Elsewhere you can see Mother Redcap depicted on the pub sign, I think. I'm not sure this building in itself looks particularly ancient. I could imagine this is a Georgian era rebuild, so the pub building we see today is likely at least the third incarnation. Into the 20th century, and the Holloway Road has long had an Irish community, with several other Irish pubs still surviving today. Sometime after World War II, the Mother Redcap became an Irish pub, possibly tying in with the wave of Irish workers drawn to London by all the rebuilding projects at that time. After the former landlady, Helen Phelan, retired in 2024, the pub was eventually taken on by the same owners as the Rattling Bog pub in Clapham, and they are clearly continuing with that Irish tradition. I hope that's been an interesting dive into the history of the Mother Redcap in Upper Holloway. I was certainly taken aback by just how old this pub is once I started looking into it. Take it from me, for London pubs which still exist today, it's a real rarity to find written records proving they existed in the 17th century. I think that makes it all the more a cause for celebration that this pub has come back from the brink. There certainly were concerns during that 2-year period of closure that it may never reopen, so it's really good to see that it has. Thanks for watching.